The United States is an international outlier when it comes to incarceration rates. In 2012, the incarceration rate in the United States was 710 per 100,000 U.S. residents. This puts the U.S. incarceration rate at more than 5 times the typical global rate of 130, and more than twice the incarceration rate of 90% of the world's countries. The United States is home to 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. In 1972, we had a prison population of 300,000. Today, we have a prison population of 2.3 million. Not only are the United States incarceration rates higher than any other country in the world, but they also disproportionately incarcerate Black and Latino men.
A white male has 1 in 23 chance of serving time in prison, a Hispanic male has 1 in 6 chance, and an African American male has greater than 1 in 4 chance of being incarcerated in the United States. 40.2% of the prison population is African American, even though African Americans only make up 6.5% of the American population. Stigmatization and hypercriminalization of minorities often begin in adolescence with what is known as a youth control complex. In 2002, in California, Latino youth made up 36% of the state's youth population, but made up 60% of the state's juvenile detainee population. Black youth made up 7.8% of the youth population, but made up 30% of the juvenile detainee population, making Black and Latino youth 90% of the juvenile detainee population. This hypercriminalization quite often dictates the rest of their lives.
Mass incarceration and these disturbing statistics can be directly traced back to the war on drugs. The implementation of the war on drugs, the Sentencing Reform Act, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, and the 3 Strikes Law all contributed to the monumental increase in incarceration rates.
For handling the problem of dangerous drugs, 7-fold, it will be $600 million this year. More money will be needed in the future. I want to say, however, that despite our budget problems, to the extent money can help in meeting the problem of dangerous drugs, it will be available. This is one area where we cannot have budget cuts, because we must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number 1 in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs.
Drugs are menacing our society. They're threatening our values and undercutting our institutions. They're killing our children.
But if we face this evil as a nation united, this will be nothing but a handful of useless chemicals. Victory. Victory over drugs is our cause, a just cause. And with your help, we are going to win.
The good people don't smoke marijuana.
President Richard Nixon was the first to coin the term a war on drugs, but in 1982, President Ronald Reagan turned the rhetorical war into a literal one. Crack was generally an inner-city issue and cocaine a suburban issue, so when Congress established mandatory sentencing penalties for crack that were far harsher than those for powder cocaine, it was the Black and Latinos who were getting long sentences. The amount of time in prison for 1 ounce of crack cocaine was the equivalent to 100 ounces of powder cocaine. Reagan ultimately took the problem of economic inequality and hypersegregation in America's cities and the problem of drug abuse and criminalized it in the form of the war on drugs. In many ways, the so-called war on drugs was a war on communities of color, a war on Black communities, and a war on Latino communities.
The rhetoric and portrayal of African Americans in the media has had a devastating effect on African American urban populations and mass incarceration. The media overrepresents African Americans as criminals, constantly using terms like thug and super predator to hypercriminalize the entire African American population.
Gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about why they ended up that way, but first we have to bring them to heel, and the President has asked the FBI to launch a very concerted effort against gangs everywhere.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
So then you have the society and public deliberately educated to believe that black men in particular, and minorities in general, are criminals. Bryan Stevenson best highlighted our ideologies when he said, "We make them their crime. That's how we introduce them. That's a rapist. That's a murderer. That's a robber. That's a sex offender. That's a burglar. That's a gang leader." And through that lens, it becomes so much easier to accept that they're guilty and that they should go to prison.
Audio Jungle.